So hopefully this past week, between last Thursday morning and this Thursday morning, you've looked at, written answers in the first 2 weeks in your 12-week study guide. First week was an overview to orient you to Exodus, and then week 2 was actually the text we're going to look at this morning, the first 2 chapters of Exodus. So next week, as you see there, you'll be reading and studying chapters 3 to the middle of chapter 7. And so just want to make sure we're tracking. You're in the Word during the week, and then together on Thursday morning, we get together and we go in the Word together. Also, if you missed last week, you can find there's a page on our website where these the links to these talks via video can be found. If you just go ipcmemphis.org and you click on In the Word, the picture on the front page, it'll take you to the right page where to go, and you'll find the links there. And also, we'll have these study guides or these outlines for you via PDF on the website. So if you have to miss, if you're traveling, whatever, go to the website, ipcmemphis.org, and you'll find it there. So this morning we're looking at the first 2 chapters of Exodus. Hopefully you have your Bibles with you. Go ahead and open there. Each week, as we come, I'm going to remind you of my outline that I gave you last week, because really, in my mind, that outline gives you the big ideas all the way through the book. The big idea, if there was a single thing that I want you to walk away with when you come to the first 2 chapters of Exodus, it's this: that God hears and remembers his covenant. And why do I say start with God? Well, because God, as I tried to say last time, he's the main actor in this book. Moses is the mediator, but God works through Moses in order to deliver his people. So as you'd expect, right here at the beginning, we're gonna be talking about God, even though he doesn't really move to the center stage, if you will, until the very end of our section, chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. But the big idea we're going to be going to see here is that God hears and remembers his covenant. The first 7 verses of chapter 1 represent background, if you will, to the rest of this scene that picks up in chapter 1, verse 8, and runs to the end of the section. And the background is really Genesis. When you come to Exodus and you read the first verses, one of the things that should be clear to you is that the writer of Exodus, Moses, is presuming some knowledge of Genesis. It just starts. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So right here at the beginning, the writer of Exodus is presuming you know who these people are. Why are they significant? Why are we talking about the sons of Jacob? Why are we talking about these 11 people? Who is Joseph? His name's going to come up again in verse 8, that there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. All of this information is in Genesis. It provides some measure of background to everything that's going to unfold in this book of Exodus. But not just a connection with Genesis, kind of broadly considered. There are specific things that are presumed and specific ties in this section back to Genesis. There's one passage in particular that overarches the entire scene that we're looking at here in Exodus, really the Exodus story, and it's Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. So keep your finger there in Exodus. Let's look back at Genesis 15, Genesis chapter 15. Either flip back there or scan back there on your iPads. Genesis 15. Now in Genesis 15, remember that chapter, God's made a covenant with Abraham in chapter 12. He reiterates it in 13 to a small degree, but here in 15, there's a ceremony that God undertakes to assure Abraham that his promises will come true. And it's this strange scene where they cut carcasses in half, and Abraham falls asleep, and God, represented by two images, a thing of fire, where does it say? Yeah, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passes through these pieces as if to say, if I don't keep my promises, may I be like these dead animals. God saying, may I die myself if I don't keep my promises. In the midst of that, chapter 15, verse 13, then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So God tells Abraham that, and that becomes the controlling narrative. We begin to wonder from that point on, okay, how is Abraham's family going to end up in a land that is not theirs? How will they be afflicted? How is God going to bring judgment on the nation? How are they going to plunder their enemies? Well, you get through Isaac, that doesn't happen. But then when you come to Jacob, lo and behold, Joseph goes down, and then Joseph calls for Jacob to come, and Jacob's very nervous about going to Egypt. But if you flip over to Genesis 46, you hear God say this. Genesis 46, the first 4 verses. Genesis 46, verse 1. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions in the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So God promises Jacob, if you go down to Egypt, I'm going to bring you back again, but also I'm going to make you a great nation there. Now that's not just a promise to Jacob, that's a continuation of the promise that God had made to Abraham. That God would make him a great nation, give him a great name, and through Abraham, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Those promises are given again to Isaac. They're given again to Jacob. They're reiterated in chapter 46. You go down to Egypt. I will bring you back. I'm not just the God of the hills and the plains of Palestine. My reach extends to Egypt as well. And so Genesis and those promises are looming right in the background of this introductory first 7 verses. There are other connections. The sons of Israel listed in the first 4 verses of Exodus chapter 1. It's the same list that you will find if you look at it, and you can look at it later, in Genesis 35, verses 23 to 26. Same listing, same order. The mention of 70 persons, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. That language you'll find at the end of Genesis chapter 46. Verses 26 and 27 will number Jacob's descendants as 70. But then in verse 7, chapter 1, verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. The study guide that you worked through this past week talked about how there was a connection to Genesis 1, verse 28, where God tells Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the land and subdue it. And so this sense of this creation mandate to multiply, to fill the land, that same command is given after Noah comes out of the ark. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. Be fruitful, multiply. It's the creation mandate to humanity. But while that's in the background and that language, fruitful, increase greatly, certainly does echo back to the creation mandate given to Adam and reiterated through the second Adam, Noah, it has a more direct reference, I think, to the promise that God made to Abraham that we've already heard. Over and again, God had promised Abraham that your offspring would be numberless. So, for example, Genesis chapter 13, verse 16, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if you can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Chapter 15, verse 5, and he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. And he said, so shall your offspring be. Chapter 17, verse 2, I am God Almighty. Walk before me, be blameless, that I may make a covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. 17, verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And then finally, chapter 22, verse 17, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is in the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. So the promise to Abraham was that his offspring was going to multiply greatly. And you get here to Exodus, and what do you find? The people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong. So God is keeping his promises. That's the import of the first 7 verses of Exodus. God is keeping his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The overarching promise that he is with them. They're going to be afflicted, but he's going to bring them out. They're going to plunder their enemies. The promise made to Jacob, but also the promise that they would multiply greatly, that they would become a great nation. All of this is in view in the first 7 verses. It's going to come back again at the end of the section. In chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, remember, we're going to hear Moses say, God remembers his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. So God's keeping his promises is right there at the beginning of the chapter, or of the section, chapter 1, verses 1 to 7, and it's there at the end, chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, which means the overarching idea with these 2 bookends is that God hears and he remembers his covenant. Now, we have to keep that in mind as we get into the rest of this, because the rest of this is really dark. For 400 years, God's people are in Egypt. Here, as we get into chapter 1, verse 8, it becomes very dark. This is real oppression, real affliction. This isn't a movie. God's people experience horrific things. But overarching all of that is God's remembering his covenant. He hasn't forgotten them. He's with them. And that's important for us to remember when we come to places of darkness, when we come to places of difficulty, when we come to places of struggle. What we have to fall back on are these bookends. The God who is with us at the beginning, who made us fearfully and wonderfully in our mother's womb, who's governed all our actions in such a way that he's rescued us from our sin and brought us to Jesus Christ, and he promises us resurrection, new heavens, new earth. This God who's made covenant promises will surely keep them, even when it looks like things aren't happening, even when it looks like I'm an apparent failure, even when it looks like nobody cares. No, God cares. That's what this passage is teaching us. The God who keeps covenants, the God who makes them and keeps them, he cares for you. So keep that in mind as we look at the problem that arises in the text, starting in chapter 1, verse 8, which is that no one apparently, and apparently is the key word, no one apparently cares for God's people. You see that in a couple of ways. First of all, Pharaoh is presented here oppressing God's people. It's notable that there aren't many time markers or name markers in this first part of Exodus. Scholars think that this is likely happening around 1446. That's the given date of the Exodus. So if you back up 80 years, this scene's probably happening around 1526 BC. It could be a pharaoh named Tutmose. We don't really know because there's 2 alternate dates that scholars have come to try to date all of this. But I think that's not even really the point. Yes, I think this is rooted in history. I think we can figure it out. But from the writer's perspective, Pharaoh represents more than simply the king of Egypt. He actually represents a demonic figure, the tool of the devil himself, who's trying to crush the godly offspring that's from whom the warrior that's going to defeat him is going to come. And you get a clue of that the Pharaoh is doing the devil's work in verse 10. He says in verse 9, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Now that language, let us deal shrewdly, let us deal craftily with them. For a reader of Genesis, there's only one person with whom that word shrewdly or craftily is associated, and that's the devil himself. Right at the beginning of Genesis 3, now the serpent was more crafty. The serpent was more shrewd than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. And he begins to weave his web around the woman. So with Pharaoh, the Pharaoh is more shrewd, more crafty. He thinks he's wise, but he's using a demonic kind of wisdom to try to enslave God's people. And so he tries to appeal to his fellow Egyptians based on a kind of nationalism, a kind of realpolitik. Let's enslave them, and that way we can utilize them, we can protect ourselves from them, and we can limit their multiplication. That's ultimately what he wants to do. Let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. Well, they're already multiplying. Well, what's your strategy, Pharaoh? Well, he has a 3-stage strategy in oppressing God's people and preventing them from multiplying. The first is to afflict them with heavy burdens and employ them as slaves. So verse 11, "Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." So the first stage, the first strategy was to afflict God's people, ruthlessly making them work as slaves. Did it work? No, it didn't work. I'm not really sure what Pharaoh was thinking. Let's exhaust them and the men won't want to have sex. That doesn't work. We know it's never worked. What? It clearly doesn't work, right? How do we know? Well, verse 12 tells us the more they were oppressed, the more they were abused, the more they were afflicted, the more they were exhausted, the more they multiplied. Didn't work. So he goes to a second stage of oppression. He instructs the midwives to kill the sons of the Hebrews. You see in verse 15, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Sapphira, the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? Let the male children live." The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. So his second strategy was to have the midwives kill the babies, particularly if they could tell they were sons as they're coming out, to have the midwives kill the babies so that Israel would not multiply. But these two women, and this is a theme that we're going to notice again in the next section, how weak women end up thwarting evil men in this narrative. These weak women, these midwives, they fear God more than they fear Pharaoh, and so they refuse to do that. Now, some have suggested, and it may be the case, that they're shading the truth a little bit here, that Hebrew women are more vigorous and give birth before the midwives come. I tend to think what their strategy was to allow the before as the birthing's happening, they're not there yet. And as the baby's coming right out, then they come in and catch the baby so that they're technically telling the truth. Who knows what they're doing? That's not really the point. All kinds of literature has been spun over the ethics of lying in order to protect the truth, like in the Nazi occupation of Germany, and people like Corrie ten Boom and others who protected Jews, and would it be right to lie to the Nazis in order to protect the Jews? And you get into all these ethical quandaries. That's not what's going on here, I don't think. I think the real point of what Moses is saying is these women feared God. And because they feared God, they refused to obey Pharaoh, even if it was going to cost them something. And God honored them for fearing him and not going along with what the enemy, the devil himself, Pharaoh, the shrewd one, wanted them to do. And the result was that the people multiplied. The strategy didn't work. That led to a third stage of oppression from Pharaoh, and that's in verse 22. Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So Pharaoh's gone from afflicting God's people, trying to prevent them from multiplying, to trying to enlist the midwives to kill the sons, to finally he's enlisted the entire nation. If you see a Hebrew son, then get rid of them. Drown them in the Nile. Now, that's wicked, right? I mean, we have to just step back and say the murder of children, whether it's in the second millennia BC or the second millennia after Christ, right? However children are eliminated, that's a wicked, wicked plan. And it's the height of what the enemy tries to do in destroying the next generation. It reminds you of a future echo right around the time of Christ, when another king who fosters demonic rage tries to eliminate a generation of boys. You remember? It was with Herod. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 13, the wise men have departed a different way. Joseph and Mary are warned by an angel to flee to Egypt. Ironically, right, they go to Egypt to avoid persecution. And Herod, verse 16, Matthew 2, verse 16, then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they are no more. And after Herod dies, the angel comes back to Joseph and Mary and says, rise, go back. The person who wanted to kill you is dead. And Matthew quotes Hosea, out of Egypt I've called my son. Jesus ends up picturing both the protection of God, how God's going to protect Moses, so protects Jesus, but also in the same way that Moses and God's people will be coming out of Egypt, so Jesus comes out of Egypt. So you have an echo of this scene in the New Testament going forward. All to say that there's this problem that's represented by Pharaoh is a real problem. And it sets the stage for a future solution that God's going to make. It appears that the solution centers on this deliverer that's raised up, this special birth. These narratives, as you work your way through the Bible, there's several kind of hoped for, longed for, promised children who stand as kinds of deliverers. Isaac is one. In Genesis 21, the Lord visited Sarah as he promised, and the child of promise comes. Moses is another one. Samson will be another one. The angel appears to Manoah and his wife. Hannah and Samuel, that's another one. There's these promised, hoped for, longed for children where there's something special attached to them. That's similar here. But it's not obvious in the first two verses. The first two verses make this seem like a very ordinary birth. It doesn't even identify the parents at this point. You see it? Chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. So this is extremely ordinary. Pharaoh has said, any son, Egypt, that you find, if it's born to the Hebrews, throw it into the river Nile. throw it to its certain death, feed the river god Nile. This 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 god that Egypt worships, that's a kind of destroyer, do that. Many sons are born from the time Pharaoh says this. Here's just an ordinary, apparently ordinary birth with a Levite and his wife. They have a son. He's beautiful. They try to protect him. But what you find, starting in verse 3, chapter 2, verse 3, is that this child's not ordinary. He's extraordinary. And God's going to go to great lengths in order to rescue this child from death. And it starts by means of this ark. You see verse 3? When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she placed the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. This is like a little ark, like Noah. Same kind of language ends up getting used. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and covered it inside and out with pitch. So the ark that rescues Noah and his family from the floods, from the waters, gets echoed in Exodus. There's an ark that's made filled with pitch to prevent it from sinking. It's placed on the waters of death, the waters of judgment. But this ark is made for this child who we're going to know, and verse 10 is going to be named Moses. So you have this connection already of, oh, wait a second, there's something unusual about this child being placed in an ark, just like in Genesis. And then you have women. Again, this is an irony. This is a surprising way in which God's going to deliver his people. You have this heroic mother. You have the sister, Miriam. You have Pharaoh's daughter, and they're all going to play a part in rescuing Moses. And you have to remember, in the ancient Near Eastern world, this is highly unusual. Women have no status. They have no power. They're not heroes. And so the fact that you have each of these women, Moses' mother, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter, each playing a key role, suggests that something significant is going on here. The weakness of women is thwarting the wickedness of men, and especially Pharaoh. So verse 4, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sisters said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Now there's two big ironies here, right? Pharaoh has commanded all of Egypt, whenever you see a Hebrew son, throw him into the river and destroy him. So the first irony is that Pharaoh's daughter brings this child who was destined for death and yet would be the future deliverer of God's people, the very people Pharaoh's trying to destroy. She brings him into his house. Can you imagine that? I mean, how ironic is that? That the future deliverer is living in Pharaoh's house, the very one that Pharaoh wanted to destroy, and Pharaoh's paying to take care of him, feeding him, training him in all the knowledge of Egypt, making him a prince, the future deliverer of God's people, sitting in his palace. I mean, another irony is that Pharaoh pays to do all of this. Pharaoh's daughter says to Moses' mother, here, take the baby, feed him, take care of him, I'll pay you for that. So some of Egypt's possessions are being given to Israel in order for Israel to prosper so that Moses might be delivered and the deliverer of God's people. I mean, it's hugely ironic. But it's not just ironic. With Pharaoh paying Moses' mother to take care of him, And this transfer of property, of possessions, you have the beginnings, the very beginnings of what God had promised to Abraham so many hundreds of years before. You will come out with great possessions. That theme's going to come up again. I'll point it out when we get to chapter 4, point it out again in chapter 7. The idea that God's people would plunder the Egyptians it's a key promise, so that Israel's not just going to be let go. They're going to come out with great riches. God's going to bless them tremendously. He's going to repay the years the locusts have eaten. He's going to care for them in real and tangible ways. And this is a small foreshadowing of that, as Pharaoh actually pays in order for Moses to be cared for. So Moses grows up. We know from Acts chapter 7 that it's going to be 40 years between the scene when he's drawn from the waters and the next scene. What happens during those 40 years? They're sort of like the 30 years that we have between Jesus' birth narrative and Jesus showing up on the scene, where we only have one little scene in between. The scene in Luke, where he is, in Luke chapter 2, where he's at the temple in his father's house discussing theology with the scribes and Pharisees. Beyond that, we don't know. We have a summary statement in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Similar with Moses. We don't really know. Acts chapter 7, Stephen's speech tells us that he was trained in the wisdom of the Egyptians, but clearly something's going on. And that something that's going on is that Moses begins to see himself not as Egyptian, but as a Hebrew, as identifying with his people. You get an indication of that in verse 11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. So at this point, Moses has identified with his people, and part of that identification leads him to believe that perhaps he might be their deliverer. So how does he try to deliver them? Verse 12, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sea. Now, the fact that he looked this way and that suggests that he knew that he should not be doing this. This was probably not going to work out well. I really don't want anyone seeing me deal with the Egyptian in this way. But he kills him, he buries him in the sand, and thinks that this is going to help advance his people's cause. But what he finds is, even though he's identified with his people and he's in a way offered himself as a deliverer by striking down an Egyptian, he's actually rejected by his people as a prince and judge. That's what you have in verse 13. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." Moses is prepared to be a leader of God's people. He's been trained in all the wisdom of Egypt. He is a kind of prince. He now is identified with the Hebrews. He comes out to deliver them. He kills one of their oppressors. But when he offers himself as a prince and judge to try to care for his people, he's rejected. And so he flees. He flees to Midian. And I put a map on your notes just so you could see how far Midian was from Egypt. It's a long way away, right? If we think that perhaps Moses was in one of the royal fortress cities that had been built by Israel, perhaps Ramses or Pithom, you can kind of see how far Midian is. It's on the other side of Sinai, right? But he flees to Midian, and there he once again stands for justice. He protects the 7 daughters of Reuel, or Jethro, same person, and ends up settling down with them and marries Zipporah and has a son named Gershom. And he says at the end of that, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." He's raised an Egyptian, but he's really a Hebrew, but now he's in Midian, and he's going to spend 40 years in Midian, caring for sheep, caring for his wife, having 2 children, not just Gershom, but another. And he's going to be wandering around this territory, Midian and the southern part of Sinai. What was he doing? Well, part of what was happening undoubtedly was God was equipping him in lessons of humility to be able to lead God's people. But just look at the map. To me, this was one of the things that really struck me as I was preparing, is he's caring for sheep all throughout this region. Now, what's going to be significant about this region? Oh, Moses is going to come back here, right? I mean, Moses is going to come back to the very land that he knows as well as the back of his hand. For 40 years, he had been caring for sheep and wandering around all through Sinai and Midian, and this is going to be the very pathway that he's going to take to lead God's people through the Red Sea, down to Sinai, and then back up to the Promised Land. How many times had he gone by Sinai? How many times had he stood there? How many times had he prayed there? We're not certain, but those 40 years that we know nothing about between the time that Moses tries to offer himself as a deliverer and apparently fails, to when God then raises him up as a deliverer, they weren't wasted years. They weren't wasted years. You may look at parts of your life and you think, what happened? Have I wasted my life? Maybe you're in one of those stretches right now where you say, what? I don't see what God's up to here. Look, God doesn't waste your years. It may feel like you're wandering around in Midian, wondering what in the world is going on here. Well, it very well may be that God is giving you knowledge of your own heart, knowledge of your own patterns, knowledge of some kind of other context that you're involved in for some future usefulness that you have no idea about. That certainly is what happened to Moses. But the reality is that during these 40 years, God's people are still groaning. There is no delivery yet. It appears that no one cares for them, but God does. And that's the final solution. God moves forward to the front of the scene in verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue and from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So 4 key verbs that are brought together next to God. That God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew. God hadn't forgotten. God wasn't asleep. It wasn't like they shouted loud enough and God finally woke up and said, oh, I hear you now. I remember. Yeah, right. I'm supposed to deliver you. No, God was caring for them all along. But key is now God's going to move to the center stage. Those 4 verbs, we're going to see them again next week. Just a foreshadow. Chapter 3, verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have certainly seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and so forth. So those verbs come back again. And God says, I have heard, I remember, I see, I know. Guys, when you are in the midst of difficulty and it feels like no one cares, no one knows, God knows. He's the one who hears. He's the one who sees. He's the one who remembers. He knows. He knows your suffering. He knows your affliction. He knows what you're dealing with. He's not abandoned you. He's the one who's made covenant promises. He's the one who will keep them. And so as you go out today and you engage in whatever God has for you, don't forget that. Bookended on either side of the struggle you are in is the covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. He was there at the beginning. He's there right now. He'll be with you all the way to the end. And that's an encouragement I think we can take with us. So around the tables now for the next 15 minutes, 17 minutes or so, you've been in the Word yourself with a study guide. You've just heard this. I want you to talk to each other. If someone new's come to your table, introduce yourselves. But talk to each other, about one thing that you found that you had never seen before and looking at the text for yourself using the study guide. And then what was one idea or application point from what I've just said that's an encouragement to you, okay? So do that around the tables for the next 15 minutes, please.